So, so as mentioned, I'm Brian Gallagher. I'm CEO of a company called CodeLock, also the co-author of a book, Stay Cyber Safe, What Every CEO should know about cybersecurity. If you're not a CEO, it still applies to you. Our next edition, we're going to change to Chief Executive Officer, making it a little more broad. But I did spend 10 years with the U.S. government. I was in the United States Secret Service in their technical security division before moving into the private sector back in 2013. So what we're going to do over the next, say, 45 minutes or so is really talk about how some of the changing trends in secure software development are taking place. You saw the poll about CMMC. We'll be highlighting a little bit about how this particular framework is different from CMMC, but also fits into play. Very specifically, and you will get a copy of all these slides here. What we're going to be talking about is the secure software development framework, and I'm going to get into the different details of that. And you'll see with CMMC, which is the 800-171, based on which revision you're looking at, there are different elements of secure software requirements in it, but not covered in the same way. So the secure software development framework that we jump into applies to all vendors selling any type of software or product with software into the federal government as a whole, not just DoD, where CMMC is focused in. So think of it as a subset of that. But before I get started, I've been teaching these classes over the last year, literally to apexes all over the country. And we've gotten some really good feedback on how this is helpful for them and kind of tailoring it to the small and medium-sized business perspective. If you can in chat, and I'm not going to take the time while I'm talking to look at this, but I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. But just go ahead and let us know who you're with. But specifically, similar to the CMMC poll, if your company develops software, either for themselves or used by others, and whether you're using internal resources or outsourced resources, go ahead and throw that in the chat. And then if your company currently sells to the federal government, or if you want to sell to the federal government in the future, indicate that as well. And you'll see why that's important, those individual metrics there as we kind of continue to go through things. So I like to start with history. I should say towards the end, I'll break for questions, or you can always put questions in the chat and we'll come back to it. This class I've done from anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour and a half. So I'm trying to kind of put that at the 45-minute mark and still get you the content that you need. But let's start with a little bit of history and not knowing who's who and what your backgrounds are here, explain a few things out. So I think when we get into the policy part, that will make a lot more sense. Historically, security has always been very reactive. And, I mentioned my time at the Secret Service. I went into the Secret Service right after 9/11. And I happened to be an EMT working in the DC area prior to 9/11 happening. So when I think of security, think about getting on an airplane, say maybe August 11th of 2021 versus October 11th of 2021. Did anything change? Yes, a lot of things changed in the way security was approached because there was a new threat that was observed. Well, the same thing comes into play with cybersecurity. Historically, the government and the industry has been very reactive to new threats, and then they go in and push change, normally after multiple congressional inquiries and hearings and committee reviews. Something starts to happen. And so you'll see that there's a move to be more proactive when it comes to cybersecurity specifically, and not just wait for the next big attack. However, as an industry, we're really behind the curve, and it's hard for especially private companies to think about being proactive versus reactive. And there's a reason for that we'll come to in a minute. So why did the government decide to really make change? What was the cybersecurity 9/11, if you will? Well, it happened in December of 2020. It's referred to many places as a SolarWinds attack. SolarWinds was actually a cybersecurity company. They had a product called Orion, and the Russians came in and got into their software. And what came out of that was called a software supply chain attack. This was really this new way of attacking end users and affecting harm throughout a supply chain. SolarWinds has been back in the news recently, very specifically in October of last year, October of 2023. The SEC actually brought legal charges against the company and named the chief information security officer, who's Tim Brown, specifically in that suit, citing that he didn't do enough to protect shareholders in the company from an attack. And so, um, um, specifically some of the wording on that, we can dig into, but they said things like, we allege that for years, the SolarWinds and Brown ignored repeated red flags about cyber risk, which were well known throughout the company, so on and so on. So the point of this, whether it's SolarWinds, your small company, or more significant breaches we've seen recently from corporations like Clorox or the MGM Resorts breach last year in Las Vegas, you have to be paying attention to these things in your role, because liability matters and the government's not just sitting back anymore waiting for things to happen. When SolarWinds occurred, it affected 18,000 customers in every aspect of the federal government, costing over $1 billion in damage. And then from a company perspective, if you see that chart on the bottom right, their stock price just crashed. I looked recently, and their stock price was around $10 a share, which was 50% less than the low point reported on this graph. So that trend had continued. So not only does it affect you from a commercial perspective, it's also going to affect the larger picture from an economy perspective as well. So continuing with that, in the last really 3 years since SolarWinds, almost 4 years now, software supply chain attacks have increased over 700%. Some people say, are we just aware of them more now, or are they actually increasing? I think it's a combination of both. But Gartner, one of the lead statisticians in this area, say that over 45% of organizations worldwide are going to experience an attack on their software supply chain by 2025, by next year. So if you stop and think about that, 45%, it's kind of like the flip of a coin, right? That means that half of the people on this call are going to get impacted by a software supply chain attack in some way or another in the next 12 months. And so, I tend to kind of slow down and say, are you willing to flip the coin on your organization? I know that I'm not. Now, this being Apex, very focused on kind of new businesses, small and medium-sized businesses coming into play. And I've had a lot of people in the audience say, yeah, look, I get, how, Raytheon or Boeing might be under attack, or these big defense companies with top secret projects. But what about me? I'm just a small little business, right? Well, 72% of the known cyber attacks actually happen on businesses with less than 100 employees. And the average cost to those companies when it occurs is almost $200,000 a year. So when you think about it, why is 72%, 3/4 of these attacks on small companies? Well, it's because they don't have the infrastructure to protect like the bigger companies do. So they become an easy target, and they're a target of what the bad guys are trying to accomplish. When you have a cybersecurity breach, there's a lot that goes into the true cost. Yeah, there's the time and the data that's lost, or if it's a ransomware attack, maybe money that you need to pay, legal costs. But if you think about your individual business, what would happen to your bottom line if you had to stop operating, well, let's just say for the rest of today? Or what about the rest of the week, or even the rest of the month, or several months? You can see how it could completely crush and impact you as an organization. I know when COVID hit, we had a defense company, and it almost crushed us because of the world stopping. And so the same is true when it comes to a cyber attack. So trying to pull this back into software development and how software development comes into play. Um, Again, there's a wide range of people on this call. So if you are a software whiz, then I apologize for being a little high level here on some of these details. If you don't know anything about software, don't worry. You don't have to be able to code to understand what we're talking about. Within the software space, there's kind of a handful of different ways that software is put together and built. It's normally not done by one person. It's done by a collection of people, and it's a bunch of building blocks that end up getting put together. And there's different models or ways to do this. The waterfall model used to be what was most common, but what we've seen over time is things shifting and changing all the way around the circle, more to where an agile style becomes more important. And this becomes referred to as the software development lifecycle, or SDLC, which is basically a formal or informal methodology for designing, creating, and maintaining software as it's being built into the bigger collective piece. That's the finished product. Now, as I mentioned, now most of the industry has shifted to using this agile flow for building software. And this agile flow allows companies to have what's referred to as continuous integration and continuous delivery. You see, it's kind of the affinity sign here, so it never really stops. And so within Agile, you kind of have two parts. You have what's going on with the development side, where code is being planned and actually built and tested. But then you also have that operations side, where it's getting released and deployed and actually operated and monitored in real life. And so you often hear this process referred to as DevOps. And just think about like your smartphone. You're always getting updates on that smartphone. It's this continual cycle that's occurring nonstop and allowing you to stay operational. The days of the next big Windows update or something along those lines, where you have to go out and get a whole new, CD or something, is past us. Well, with this increase in threat, security has now come into play. So where it was DevOps, now it's being referred to as DevSecOps, which is development, security, and operations. So rather than thinking about security after the software is built, this new approach is intended to integrate security into both the development build process and the operations release process. So when we're talking about cybersecurity, specifically related to software, what I tend to do is kind of pause for a second and say, listen, there is no silver bullet to doing this. Cyber is a big, messy environment. There's all kinds of different things you need to look at and prioritize, whether it's the outer, walls of your castle and you're looking at perimeter security, or is it the network, or is it the actual endpoint devices that are plugging into the network? Or is it application security? Application security is kind of at the level that we're talking about right now, that the software or applications that you're using that are being built, or even the data that then goes into that. So kind of keep in mind that when you're looking at cybersecurity, it can be very overwhelming. But we're specifically talking about kind of that building block of where it's started. It doesn't do you any good to protect the perimeter if the foundational software within the perimeter is broken and breached. So within that software piece, Gartner's come out with what they call their DevSecOps toolchain, which is very similar to the DevSecOps, agile CI/CD process that we saw earlier. Why I like to highlight this is that even within software, you can see about 10 different practice areas on things that happen. You're looking at, software as it's being created. But then how is the software being signed and is it being verified? And there's all kinds of testing that can be done, and it can become very big and complicated. So what the industry has said is, what we really need to do is we need to do what's referred to as shift left. And that's kind of become a little bit of a cliche these days. But if we can take our security and shift left more towards the starting point on the circle, up where software is actually being created, we can do a lot of things, and it can come down to having a more efficient product, and saving money, from a commercial perspective. If you look at this chart here, and these are just average numbers, but if you've built a piece of software and it's in production and you find a problem with that software in production, you're looking at it costing you about $7,600 per defect. And these are just average numbers that were done by research, from the Pony Institute in 2027. Well, they found as you shift left, that same $7,600 defect in production, if you found it during the coding process, you're looking at about $80 to get that fixed. Maybe a third or half a man hour's worth of time. So you can look at the efficiencies in this shift left, concept, and looking at security at the beginning process. Well, with all security, it's really about risk, right? And how do we reduce risk? And how do we think about that as far as our organization's concerned specifically? And I used to say, when I was working in the Secret Service here, it's really easy to protect the president. All we need to do was put him in a bubble and lock that bubble in the basement, and nobody's going to get to him, and he's going to be fine. But the president can't do their job that way. And nor could you, as a software developer, if that was the case. So I know that everybody here doesn't work at the White House and you're not in the Secret Service, but I want you to kind of stop and think for a minute about what the goal of your specific business is. Like me and kind of my background, you might have a passion for better protecting the government or our nation, and that's why you're looking at doing business with DoD. But your business is ultimately operating to make money and make a profit. If that's not what your goal is, it's called a hobby, not a business. So assume that everybody's in here trying to actually make a little bit of money with what they're doing. Problem with that is that when it comes to software development, focusing on profit can cause a conflict when prioritizing the speed of software development releases compared to the importance of security. And if you think about it, you think about your organization or organizations you work for, kind of the speed, getting the software out, getting it in front of the customer, getting to the next milestone that you can bill for, or that next product release out to get paid on. You want this to happen as efficiently and as fast as possible. Well, over here on the right side are these security guys who want to come in and inspect what you're doing and slow you down and kind of cause all these problems. And it creates this rift. And the developers have historically said, stay away from my software. Well, when you go up a level to the CEO, who normally wins those fights, it tends to be the development side, because they're directly correlating to cost, or revenue coming into the company, versus that security side of the house being more of the risk mitigation piece. So what I tend to do is say, with that in mind, think back to that coin flip. Okay, well, that's great. I understand trying to get software out, and I understand trying to make money. But if half of the people on this call are going to get attacked in the next 12 months, isn't that something that we should be considering and prioritizing? Well, the government thought so. And so the government said, hey, it's time for some change here. And they felt like the companies, by themselves, weren't doing enough to protect their own software, and that the private sector, was ultimately transferring all of that responsibility onto the purchaser of the software and putting the blame back on the attackers, versus looking at their responsibility of what they were doing when they were building the software in the first place. So that's why the government stepped in, and the White House actually signed an executive order on May 12th of 2021. And that executive order was about enhancing the security of the software supply chain through secure software development practices. That executive order has been referred to as a few different things, EO 14028. You've also may have heard it as referred to as the Software Supply Chain Guidance, or Section 4E. But what the White House said is that they can't directly control what the private sector does, but they absolutely can control what the federal government buys and whom they buy it from. So as an indirect result, they're going to hit businesses who choose not to comply right in the bank accounts. And so this becomes really important to see. Out of the executive order, the White House tasked the NSA, the Department of Homeland Security, and NIST to come up with a plan to improve the nation's cybersecurity and to do it quickly. So that plan, what came out of this plan was this new NIST framework, the Secure Software Development Framework, also known as NIST 800-218. And so the Secure Software Development Framework looked back to all of the things in the Software Supply Chain Guidance, Section 4E, and actually pulled that out and put it into a framework that can be followed. And so the document describes a set of 42 fundamental sound practices for secure software development, which falls into this SSDF. And regardless of whether you're selling to the government or not, organizations really should integrate the SSDF, into their software development practices. But if you are selling to the government or want to, this now becomes a must versus just a good idea. All right, so kind of digging in a little bit deeper here. What did this all do, and why should you care listening to me right here? So a standard by itself is not necessarily enforceable. It's not law. So the Executive Office of the President, via the Office of Management and Budget, issued Memorandum 22-18. And this, in summary, mandates that all agencies comply with this new NIST guidance, and obviously the executive order section 4E part. Each agency was told that they must enforce the policy within 270 days of the issuance of this first memo. So you can see it's small in there, but September 14th, 2022 was when that memo came out. And it was set to go into effect on June 12th, 2023. So we can see here that was that first piece. Well, typical government, June 12th was a Monday, so June 9th, on the Friday prior, they had to come out with an update. And what that update did is it gave OMB and the government and vendors just a little bit more time, and it clarified a little of things that had come up in questions since. So what DHS was doing is DHS was actually set to authorize a final version of an attestation form that had to get submitted to contracting officers with this. That attestation form wasn't complete yet. And so the updated memo said 6 months after this new form gets approved by OMB, agencies must start to collect these attestations. And so it was actually set for 3 months for critical software and 6 months for the rest of the software. Also during this time, some things came out in the Federal Register, some clarification pieces. And DHS said they assume that about 2,700 initial submissions would have to happen within the civilian government, not even focusing on the DoD side, from people that are going to have to comply right away. And they looked at, okay, well, what do we think the cost is going to be for organizations, companies to have to put everything in place to be able to truly attest to this new framework. And DHS came out and said, well, we think it's going to actually be over 11,000 person hours per year to be able to do this at an average cost of just under $1 million. And so, like me as a small business, I kind of fell off my chair and said, there's no way I can do that. Um, Heck, I don't think I even made that much profit last year, right? So keep in mind, this is an average. So if you're a big defense contractor, it's going to be a lot more. If you're an SMB, it's going to be a lot less. And you'll see how we've helped to make that even more efficient outside of this. So Federal Register information came out, as mentioned, November of 2023. The most recent version of this draft and the new attestation piece came out. The form was set to be finally approved last month in January. I had checked yesterday and it's still pending. So what this means is we're looking at probably April/July before all these attestation forms are gonna to go into effect. But I'm already seeing throughout the industry, throughout contracts, throughout RFPs, the language is already being put in, and aspects of the SSDF are already being requested, like a software bill of materials that we'll touch on. So, kind of jumping forward a little bit here. This is not CMMC. Okay, I mentioned that up front. And the reason why I mention it again here is that within CMMC, you had attestation as well, where you could raise your hand and say, hey, I'm good to go. And really you aren't. And so most of the industry was just doing that. Level one, yep, I'll sign the form. I want to get that contract and I'll deal with it later, right? Well, with this, the government said, we need to make sure that you're actually doing the things that you're saying you're doing. So where step one is, hey, we're going to self-attest. And if there's something that we're not doing, we have to be able to have a plan of action or milestone known as a POAM. Well, step two is you actually have to produce all of your artifacts and evidence and give that into the contracting officer as backup and proof that you're actually doing the things that you're attesting to. The other part with this is they changed some of the rules. So the only person that can sign that attestation form is the CEO or the COO of the organization. So the government wanted to make sure that all of the responsibility and legal liability was going to stop at the top versus executive leadership being able to point the fingers at anybody else. Well, the last step of this is if the government looks at the information that you presented, or if the project ends up being so critical, they can decide to mandate a third-party attestation, which is going to be done via 3PAO. So they're the same, kind of FedRAMP certified assessors that will come in at your cost and have to look through all of your information and make sure if what you have is accurate or not. So how much is this actually going to cost and how much is it going to cost me, right? I mentioned the Federal Register and, the $1 million, and I told you not to get, too upset about that right away. So, keep calm. There's a lot that's been going on over the last 2 years to try to streamline this and make this easier and more efficient for companies. There's been a whole industry that has picked up and literally tens of millions of dollars, going into trying to help make this more efficient. So in Maryland, I'm actually in Virginia, although I'm formerly from Maryland. Used to work with the Maryland government and firefighter in Maryland. So in Maryland, there's over 10,000 defense contractors. Virginia actually has 18,000 defense contractors. And so, the DMV area as a whole, obviously with the seat of federal government, there's a lot of focus on, government contracting, right? So with Virginia specifically, last year they said, hey, we have 18,000 defense contractors. If they're not able to sell their product to the federal government, that's a lot of tax dollars that we're going to lose. So what can we do to help this process? So my company was actually awarded a grant by the Commonwealth of Virginia last year to specifically focus on how do we streamline this for small and medium-sized businesses. How for as low as $19 a month can we help a company to do this versus having to look at that $1 million a year. We came up with a way to automate a lot of things and carry a company through this process and save them over 90% of those manpower costs. So if you're like me, you're like, how in the heck did you do this? What type of magic sauce? Well, our background was in AI. So the first thing we did is we came up with a integrated compliance dashboard that lists out all of the 42 different things that you need to do to be compliant. We found that none of the GRC vendors, the big ones like Jada or Vanta, had any tools for company focused on the SSDF. So we decided to put that together, for you, giving you the ability to upload your artifacts and evidence right into the system and track and trace where you're at and provide reporting, internally and externally. The second thing we did is uh, from a reporting perspective, the software bill of materials, the SBOM, is a big piece and part of the SSDF. In fact, some people have thought that the SBOM is the SSDF, but it's one out of 42 different things. So we said, how can we also integrate this in and auto-generate all of the SBOM information that's needed for clients in both human readable and machine readable formats? And so we did that as well. For those that have no idea what an SBOM is, think about when you go to the grocery store and you look at the food label on the side of a box. The software bill of materials is basically a breakdown of the pieces and parts and components within the software. So if there ends up being a vulnerability, something like Log4j, and you have no idea if the software you're using has that component or version in it, the SBOM is what's going to tell you that and give you that information. And all vendors now, all software producers are required to produce an SBOM and for it to be made available upon request from any customer. So we automated and streamlined that. Kind of DoD big picture, like I try to put this into perspective. Think about the Department of Defense, issuing Lockheed Martin $1 billion contract, and Lockheed Martin has 1,000, subcontractors, subs on that, and all those subs have their own subs and they're outsourcing. And before you know it, absolutely down that supply chain, there's somebody in China or Russia that has fingers into keyboard. Recent news, I think it was the F-35 program got put to a halt because they found a part that was actually made in China. So that was, physical supply chain versus software supply chain. But you can see how the two go together. So with that, in December of 2020, we actually invented and patented a way to create a chain of custody between the software developer and the code up and down that supply chain. And we said, similar to when you're on a crime scene and you're finding evidence and you're bagging it and tagging it, can we track and trace that, all the way through the process, just like you can do with evidence going to court? And so we did that by mimicking how blockchain works. And, I won't get into the big details of this, but by looking at linking all of these different blocks together, in the event that there is a breach or some unauthorized change in the code, like happened with SolarWinds, it's going to break the chain. And so how we've blocked all of our software together, it's going to tell us exactly where and when you need to look at it. IBM puts out a report and says on average, it takes 207 days to know that your software has been impacted. That was absolutely true with SolarWinds. So it was December of 2020. when we learned about the attack. We now know that the Russians were in the software January, February of that year, and there's some reports that say it was even the fall prior. So think about saving literally 207 days and being able to instantly know if something had changed in your source code, being able to get alerted on that, and so on. We've also looked at, where the developer is actually, working at and who they are. I want to make sure that Brian is actually Brian and not somebody just with Brian's credentials. So we have a biometric piece that we can come into and actually look at where the developers are working from. So the end result of this is teamwork. Everybody's happy. The development side of the house is happy because we've come up with a way to implement security and not negatively impact their flow. The security side of the house is happy because the software is more secure, and the bosses are happy because things are still getting sold, they're saving money, and they're making money. Kind of in ending here, just to point out, DHS actually came out with a big endorsement on our approach right after SolarWinds, talking about how we can stop the most sophisticated criminal malware. And they also said, with respect to cyber attacks from hostile nation states, CodeLock would be extremely effective.
Hi, my name's Brian.
Oh, we'll skip over that, save some time. And then you may have heard about us anywhere from Forbes to Barron's. Locally in the DMV area, we've been getting a lot of awards. And even on the tech side, out in San Francisco, TechCrunch selected CodeLock as one of the top 200 new technologies for last year. So all that being said, I'm going to stop here. You can feel free to take out your phone and scan that if you want to get on my calendar and talk to you more. We've set up a way to do this starting at $19 a month. So it's extremely easy for us to come and hold your hand and get it done without those big dollars and facts. I'm going to pause and take a sip of my coffee and look at our chat here and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Brian. That was great. Yep. So now is your opportunity to ask Brian your questions. If there's anything you would like him to go over again, or if you have a question pertaining to the topic today and your business. I know a few people posted in the chat introducing themselves and their business, which is great. Thank you. But yep, so if you have anything that you'd like him to reiterate or talk about regarding this topic, now's your chance to ask. And whilst we're waiting for that, just like to remind you all that your Apex Accelerator counselor is available to advise you. Obviously, they're not cybersecurity experts, but they definitely have the resources and can guide you in the general strategy. So if you have not spoken to your counselor this year, then make sure you email them and request a counseling session. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions come through. So I guess you covered everything, Brian. Thank you. So please do take advantage of learning more about what Brian's company has to offer there. So any parting words, any final words, Brian, before we sign off?
I just hope everybody has a great week, and please feel free to reach out if there's anything related to this, or if you just have a generic question. You have my contact information, and I'm extremely happy to help any way I can. So thank you.
All right, that's great. Thank you so much, Brian, and thanks everybody for participating today, and we hope to see you at a future Maryland Apex Accelerator event. Thanks. Bye-bye.